fam, what if I told you that a lot of factors that exist in society today are just a way of influencing us to live a certain type of way? Take, for example, religion or culture or social norms. I think someone put them in place to get us to live a certain type of way. And guys, I get it. I could be wrong, but again, the good news here is that I stand to be corrected. And that's the whole point of this podcast. If you're an open-minded person willing to challenge the status quo in pursuit for knowledge and deeper understanding of life, then welcome to Joanne on Air podcast. Did you guys know that there are currently over 3.2 million podcasts all over the world today? Crazy, right? I mean, that's literally the same number of people that exist in some countries. Like, take, for example, Namibia. So if you want to put this into context to understand how huge that number is, it's as if the entire Namibia's population woke up today and decided to start a podcast. No pun intended anyways. I want to shift this to the African perspective. So research from 2022 by Africa Podfest confirmed that there are over 1,000 podcasts that are being produced in Africa. This number, I'm sure, has either doubled or tripled since then. The numbers of how many podcasts exist in Uganda are honestly not as clear, but we can all agree that that number continues to rise day in, day out now that access to technology and the smartphone and mics aren't like a hard thing anymore for Ugandans. But a couple of things on my mind today and things we actually need to talk about. One is, do we need another podcast anyways? Or do people just need to find friends to talk to without bothering us on air? 2 is, are video podcasts the same thing as audio podcasts? 3 is, if people are not able to listen to you without the urge of watching you, then I don't think you have a podcast. So this and more in today's episode of Joanne on Air. Hi, Bonnie. How are you today?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I like when I get invited to talk. I usually interview people, so when I get a chance to be interviewed, it makes me nervous, but I also like it because I get to speak my mind.
Right. I was gonna ask you if that happens to you a lot, because I feel the same. Like, people don't ask me questions a lot, so even when I'm like with people outdoors, I always make them uncomfortable with the question. So when someone comes at me, I'm like, what? I'm like very shocked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you get invited a lot of time.
So I don't get invited a lot of time, but lately, actually, a lot of people have invited me on their podcast, like a lot. Like, I think in the last month, I've been on like 3 podcasts.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I like it. I like it. It makes me nervous. I found out like it makes me nervous. It's usually good to be in the seat than to be the one being asked. So
yeah, it feels like you've given your power away.
So that's why I say kudos to my guests. They do a really amazing job, because if you try to swap seats, then you feel it.
I get you. My first unpopular take today is, do we need another new podcast today? I mean, like, there's like a billion of those. Can you just catch a break and leave us alone?
I feel like, so I'm happy when people start, like it's a way of putting information out there. So like the more we are, it's like the more word will go out. I don't know if that's what you meant. Like, do we need another people starting podcasts? Is that what was your question, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of podcasts in Uganda, but which it makes me happy. I don't look at it as a competition. I look at it as people coming together to put information out. So whoever feels like it, they can join the party. But it's about perseverance and how to stick through it, Like, I'm happy that people are starting podcasts, and because we're all on the same goal to put information out there to help the people. And we're trying to push away that kind of Ugandan media thing, people who have those YouTube channels about gossip, putting
Yeah.
people down, abusing people. So when we
Mm.
start this podcast, they kind of like a professional conversation, unless
Mm.
people want to do it differently. So I think anybody can start it. It's about who can stay up.
Right. I like that you're looking at it in that angle. Like we get to kick out the mediocre content creators who just
Mhm.
sit and talk recklessly about celebrities and though unfortunately I think Ugandans like that stuff a lot. I don't know if you've noticed
Yeah,
a
they
lot
do.
of like
They
the
do.
Wazeka content creators on TikTok, they have huge following because Ugandans sort of have like I don't know mental headspace for things
Yeah.
like that.
Yes, I have. And actually, I was talking about it with one of my friends. Like, you see, we put this content. Tebagara knew to be. So I don't know. I don't know if you will allow me to use Luganda on your podcast, but they don't
That's
like serious things. Ugandans do not like serious things. Like, and I understand it to one extent because they're going through a lot, so
yeah,
they feel
yeah.
like sitting down to listening to a serious conversation. They
Mm,
want something that will take their minds off whatever they're going through or their struggle. So they tend to listen more to that the unserious conversation about like gossip or things like that. But that's our job as podcasters to actually kind of like force ourselves into their lives, like bringing this conversation that's going to help them. Sometimes when somebody's struggling, they don't know what they need unless somebody tells them like, you should probably do this, you should probably do that. Or sometimes people seek out to be like, I'm going through this, but what do I need to do? So there, as podcasters, this is where we come in. Like, this information that we talk about on podcasts, maybe they
mm,
don't know that's what they need, but we just need to put it out there and it will like help them.
right. Mm, okay. I wanna continue on the part where Ugandans are going through a lot. They do
Hmm.
not know. They don't need that whole overly serious. I think I picked that energy off people a lot when I was doing my old podcast, and so my friends when we would hang out, not my friends, but like I would hang out in some circles, and people were like, "We kind of going no gezi like." To me, that all the time, my podcast is always talking about, I don't know, evolve, do better, don't you want it better for your life, find yourself, blah, blah, blah. And then they were like, hey, like all the time for you, you're holding someone accountable. Can't you like chill?
Yeah,
Ugh.
yeah, it's crazy. And that's one of the weaknesses that people have faced, people who are starting podcasts, because you come into this space
Mm,
thinking that you're going to blow up like what other people's content is. Like when you go to YouTube, like people who do those celebrity gossip, what Aticha is, what this happened, the Lugambo. So their
mm,
content sells a lot, and that's why most podcasters have given up quick. I was like, "Oh, no, it's a bit ambula." It's kind of takes time. It's going to take time. It's not, and that's something I've preached to myself even when I started my podcast. Like it's taking time. Right now, I'm thankful and like it's starting to pick up. Like people are getting used to this podcast. So like
mm,
I know many podcasts are starting, but also Ugandans are actually getting into it. Like people are getting to listen to it, and people's lives are getting changed. So I think
mm,
we're doing a good job. But yeah, that has been the thing for a long time. Ugandans and their conversations and what they like to see, the
mm.
unserious stuff is crazy.
Okay. When you were speaking, my mind went to they say Ugandans don't read. They used to say, I don't know if they still say that Ugandans don't read. But now Ugandans, even now with the way content has evolved from, I don't know, traditional media to read in the newspaper to listen to
Mhm.
radio,
Yeah.
Ugandans don't want to listen to podcasts. They want to watch podcasts on
Mhm.
YouTube or on
Mhm.
TikTok. Like even the I don't want to say the spirit or the habit of like while you cook, while you, I don't know, take your evening walk, while you drive to work, there's still a gap for them to consume because that's what podcasts do to. That's the advantage they have over any other form of media because then again, now with the in a generation in an era where there's like addiction to like scrolling and seeing things on your device, podcast sort of lets you detach from your device. So, do you think there's still a gap for people to consume podcasts the way they were originally intended to be consumed?
But I like the part where you said people like to watch. And when I was starting my podcast, I started it as an audio, which like how we're doing right now.
Mm,
So I noticed that what you just said that people like to watch, and that's why I
mm,
went into the video space too. So then I started doing the YouTube because I put my podcast up on YouTube, and my podcast is everywhere. Like
mm.
wherever somebody will get a podcast, whether audio. And the good thing now, Spotify is also doing video. You can either
Podcast.
choose, yeah, you can choose to watch it as a video, or you can choose to watch it as an audio.
Mm,
Um, it's cool for some people who, and the Ugandans have time. And this is something I've learned, like difference between the US and Uganda. Like Ugandans have time because not everybody goes to work, or not. Even if people go to work, they can watch while they're
yeah.
working, or like they have a
Mm,
lot of freedom, which is different from like the US. I mean, the US, there's depending on the profession.
mm,
But from my profession, maybe I cannot, maybe on break or something. So I find it hard to sit through uh, a video podcast because we can listen to music and stuff at my work, but you can't just sit there and watch a video because it's physical work. So
yeah.
it hinders that. So where in America, a lot of people listen to audio podcasts, like when they're driving, when they're
Mm,
working, and they can put their headphones in. But in Uganda, a lot of people like YouTube, and my content was mostly 90% about Ugandans, you know? So
mm,
that's why I went into the video space. And it's hard to grow YouTube in Uganda too. I'm not gonna lie, unless people buy followers. Which that's one of the decisions I decided when I was starting my podcast. I am not gonna put money in buying following.
mm,
I am not gonna put money in buying following. So growing YouTube organically is hard, and you have to do the right things and the algorithm. That's the hardest part of um, content and stuff. But yes, video is good, but it's costly, even like to an upcoming podcaster, somebody who's
yeah.
just starting. No, it's you're
It
gonna need a
is.
camera.
It's,
It now it brings in a lot of other things that you don't have. You're gonna need a camera. You're gonna need blah. But again, I tell people start with what you have. So I like this. Like this is what will work for now. We're gonna go with that because there's people still who listen to it. There's people who still.
yeah.
There's one person I know for sure who listens to like just Spotify, and they are engaged on there and they're stuck to that. It was just
Mm.
until some person was listening to my episode and said, "Oh, this girl said she looks like Arista. Let me go to YouTube and see what she looks like."
No.
But this person was always on audio until she got to that point and she had to go to YouTube to see what this person looks like. But she's always
Mm.
like on Spotify. But yeah, I see there's need of that, and a lot of people are going into that. But when I say that, I put a caveat on that don't let that stress you, or don't let that stop you from doing what you can do. Because see, I don't have a camera, so I won't do a podcast. No, start with what you have.
I'm clapping for you right now, like round of applause. I totally hear you. Um, have you seen this meme? I think that's going around on, I think, is it LinkedIn or everywhere, where it says people who schedule too many meetings, I think, don't have anyone to talk to at home, and they should instead start a podcast.
And they do what?
They should instead start a podcast. Like people who talk too much in, like, in
Yeah.
work settings and all, like, don't you have people to talk to? Or I don't know, start a podcast or something. So I also honestly think, not like I am the podcast police or I'm trying to become one, but what's the bar of who should and who shouldn't start a podcast? Do we get to say, hey, just because you think you have a good idea, not a
Mhm.
good idea, just because you think you have an opinion, doesn't mean you should start a podcast to voice
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Is that something you believe, or I mean, it's a free world, everyone should do whatever they
Right.
want?
So I'm kind of half and half on that because I'm human, and I sometimes I get to be like, why did you even start a podcast? Like, why everybody? So everybody is starting a podcast, and
Why did you start your podcast?
so I started my podcast just to share our stories. I started actually with sharing my personal story, my personal journey. because of the things that I've achieved. And I was just, my heart was back to the people or my friends back home. I was like, this would be good information for the people back home, for the kids back home to
Sorry,
listen.
so you started the podcast after you moved to the US?
Yes, I was in the
Oh.
US. It was in the pandemic, in COVID,
Mm.
because we all had time on our hands. And I was in the US. I had
Mm.
started doing my job because I'm not a podcaster for a job. I'm a full time like aircraft mechanic. So I do that Monday through Friday, and then I
Mm.
do podcast on Saturday. Um, but my journey, there's not a lot of people who can say I'm doing my dream job, you know. And I
Yeah.
felt like that was a unique thing about me because I'm doing my dream job. Like something I always said when I was 8 years old that I want to do is what I do right now. So I was like,
Mm.
that would be cool to document that journey because a lot of people are like, you should write a book, you should write a book. But I'm not a writer and I'm not a person who likes to read books. Like you said, you were saying like Uganda is known for like a background of Ugandans don't read, which I
Mhm.
am one of them. And I think I blame my school, my high school, because we never had a lot. No, it was primary school. We never had a library in my primary school. So we did not get that reading habit, you know? And
Yeah.
my parents didn't have money to buy even textbooks or together, like those
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
So when you get to that point of like you should write a book about your journey, blah 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 blah, I cannot write. And then I had to look out for people who can help me write that story. I was like, you know what? In COVID, we had a lot of time, and I was listening to other podcasts, and people were doing kind of similar thing, talking about their journey, blah 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 blah. This is how I started. This is where I'm at, and I was like, what? I can do that. I can talk because I know I can talk,
Mm.
and that's what you were saying earlier. Like people who think they can talk, they should start a
It's
podcast.
a podcast. Yeah.
So that's basically was me. I was like, I can talk, so I started a podcast, and I started. It was supposed to be like a personal journal, like where I come and talk about my journey, I talk about what's happening, where I've got, thinking that somebody's gonna tune in and they get inspired.
Mm.
So that's what I did, and I started the podcast. But when I did like 5 episodes, maybe about by alone, and I
Mm.
was like, you know what? Maybe there's other people out there that can come on here and share about the journey. So that's how I
Mm.
got into starting having guests, and then I
Yes.
started bringing guests on the podcast. And now it's been a while since I did a solo podcast on my podcast. It's been a while. It's been over like 3 years or two, three
Mm.
years. But going back to your question, um, we're human. Sometimes you think some people start podcasts to put other people down. I'm like, why did you even start? Which is good for them. And sometimes you feel like, Banang, everyone is starting a podcast, especially in Uganda. Everybody's starting a podcast. Who's starting a podcast? Who
Let,
is
let,
starting?
let's talk about the podcast now in Uganda. I don't think there are a lot of people who are actually podcasters. I think a lot of people are doing YouTube channels. No offense to like a couple of them. Like I'm saying that because of the people, and I quote, that we think are podcasters in Uganda. First give me like five off head.
So the Mob Jers,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna count Unpopular Opinion as a podcast because I
I don't
was
think it counts as a
we're
podcast.
gonna talk about it. I have yeah, I
Okay.
have the opinion about,
Okay.
but I'm counting them because when we're doing the Pulse Awards, I was in nominated with them,
Yeah.
which I also like asked myself about that. Well, there's On Uganda and there's the Ugandan podcast, which is the government podcast, and
The
that's a
government is
podcast.
starting a podcast. The government has a podcast.
The government has a podcast, and that's my guest today on my podcast. Actually, they have
Oh God.
the Uganda
That's
podcast.
very new to me. My God. Is this on
Yeah,
Apple Podcasts?
you should tune in on my episodes. That's what I'm shooting today. It will be out sometime, but it's about the Ugandan podcast. And those were also in the same um nominations or the Pulse Awards. I'm
Mm,
actually in a WhatsApp group of podcasters. I don't
mm,
communicate a lot, but the Ugandans have a WhatsApp group of podcasters in there. Um, there is also another one that I was nominated with, the Chitakas. But that's a so yeah, so those are your five. I've given you the five.
mm.
Now I'll go back to your question of like, does unpopular opinion count as a podcast? Or what is even, so it could be, I'm not the person who is going to determine what is a podcast and what's not a podcast, because people these days, somebody can do anything and just call it a podcast, like it's
Yeah.
something, you can call it a podcast. Um, so for me, the unpopular opinion at first, I looked at it as a show. It was like a show, like, it was, but I don't know what I could say not to call them a podcast, because they
Mm,
share topics. They talk about different topics, and they've had guests on their
yeah.
show. So,
I so
oh,
I think I sorry, I honestly think that when you were speaking, guess what I did? I googled the word podcast. It's a digital audio file made available on the internet for downloading to a computer or mobile device, typically available as a series. So I think podcasts were originally just audio. I think now
okay.
maybe with the marketing part, people have to put like a face to a voice. You get
Hmm. Hmm.
to with the way we are wired really as a human race and the way we consume content is we need to see someone. That's how now video podcasts have become a thing. Two people
Hmm.
sitting on a couch, mics set up, blah blah blah, and then now then because originally that would be a YouTube channel of because people used to do these things all the time. Like people had YouTube channels where take for example like Kasuku would interview I don't know Cindy or the Blue
Yeah.
Three. And it
Yeah.
wasn't called a podcast, but now Kasuku apparently has a podcast.
A podcast.
You get my point. I
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, I get it. I get what you're saying. Which is hard now. Like, and I understand now your question. Why you say like is everything has turned into a podcast. Like
podcast,
every
yeah,
um. So like even NBS can get their news and they make it into a podcast.
a
Like NBS
podcast,
podcast.
yeah. No, I've seen. Is it Stan Big Bank also has started a
Oh yeah,
podcast?
Stomach. Yeah, I saw that. I saw that. Stomach Bank has a podcast. I've watched a few. They've had a few guests on there that I've had on my podcast. So yeah, it looks like everybody is starting a podcast, which I'm not against, and I'm
Same.
not. I'm not gonna judge who should start a podcast and who should not.
Mm.
It's all about time will tell. Like some people get
Oh
hyped to
yeah,
something, and
right, right.
2 years down the road, it's
That's a very
yeah.
bossy move. Time will tell. We'll see who'll be here by the end of.
Actually, let me just steal some of my notes because I'm going to talk to the notes of my podcast today. I have a quote that I'm going to talk about there, but since I'm on your podcast now, let me
Mm,
just even talk about it here. Um,
mm,
there's a quote that says, "To be in top," and this was quoted on the Uganda podcast, which I'm going to bring up because I'm going to talk about their podcast. They had it on their Instagram. They were
mm,
celebrating 30 episodes, or maybe standing through. And this quote was, "To be in the top 1% of podcasts globally, you only need to publish 21 episodes. The real competition isn't the 2 million podcasts that are out there, it is the 20,000 podcasters who persevered." So
mm.
you think about like 21 million podcasts in the whole world. Let's not even just think about Uganda because there's podcasts like in America, there's a lot of podcasts in America.
Podcast, yeah.
But that is not your competition, or even I actually for me, I don't even look at them as competition. I look at them as partners. But
Yeah.
if they are there to, unless somebody starts something and is just going against what you're doing is what they are trying to put down or fight against, then that's
Mm.
competition right there. But if somebody's in their lane, they're doing their thing, I don't really give one. But um that's not your competition. Again, a competition is like these people who have stuck through, like, and I don't like to use the word competition, but like for me because the people that motivate me are actually podcasters. Like for me, people that motivate me to do my podcast, it's other podcasters. Like I like these American guys, Steve, Jay Shetty. They have this good Jay Shetty actually is one biggest. My style of
Yeah, I listened
podcasting
to
is
you.
like his style of podcasting, and I picked a leaf from him of the
Mm.
things I do. And when I get celebrities on my podcast, which I do, like I've had a conversation with APAS, and my style of question I ask those celebrities are different from what Kasuku is going to ask those celebrities, and that's why mine
Yeah.
is different. When
Oh,
I
yeah,
bring
that's what makes it stand out.
the celebrities on my podcast, I want to know the things that they have achieved their life. Like we know them through music, but outside music, who are they? What are they? What are they like? Like a lot of things that Ape has talked about on podcasts, he doesn't talk about anywhere else on media because those are not the things they focus on. But as people, we need to learn the other side of these, the people that we look up to. So that's why I try to do like a different style of podcasting. I don't bring anybody down. It's just uplifting. And if there's been a conflict, I try to clarify that. I give that person an opportunity to clarify the conflict that they talked about on another podcast. Like in my next episode that's coming out, there's an incident from another podcast, the Zamba. I don't know if you know, GNL Zamba has a podcast. Um, I don't know if you know that the Zamba
No, I don't think I
podcast.
know. I don't think I know about it.
My friend, I think there's a lot of podcasts in Uganda. I'm telling you now, like there's a lot. Um,
Right.
but they said a statement on there about the person I hosted on my podcast, and I gave them that opportunity to clarify. I didn't attack the other podcast before they said. I was like, I had this on this podcast. What is your opinion or what is your take on that? And something like that to clarify. And I know they were not doing it in a bad way or to harm anybody. It's just a type of conversation, like make sure it's a safe place for everybody. So there's a lot that will go through in that. And perseverance is the hardest part of this podcast. It gets stressful sometimes.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I hear you. I hear you. When you were listing all these podcasts, and I was thinking to myself, I'm like, I think a lot of success for this podcast is coming more from the fact that these are maybe recognized entities or individuals, not like GNL.
Hmm.
When you say
Hmm.
Stanbic, when you say the government of Uganda, it's their success may be more influenced by their, I don't want to say
Positions or like,
their positions or marketing or wherever,
yeah,
rather than the content that they
yeah,
are putting out.
right, right. I agree with that because actually I'll give you another example. Who So you'll be grinding for because you're nobody. Like you just came out of or
Yeah.
you start your own podcast as a person, but then a celebrity will start their podcast, and the first year or the first episode they will just boom
Yeah.
because they are known, and it's no offense to them. That's them,
I mean,
and like,
of
and I
course, yeah.
don't really. It doesn't carry me over because you'd be like, I've been grinding for 3 years, I've not hit,
Yeah.
but the celebrity comes, they start their podcast, they're using their fame to promote their podcast, like you were saying, to market their
Podcast, yeah.
podcast. So yes, so that's even every time we talk, I remember another podcast, Nampera, Christine Nampera. They have a podcast.
Yeah, same. I don't think that's a podcast either. That's a YouTube channel.
Yeah,
No, I'm not even trying to podcast police, honestly, but I'm like, hey, like a
yeah,
podcast is like, I think what I'm going to keep telling people is that if someone is able to listen to you without having to see your
watch it.
face, yeah, to
Yeah,
watch it, then you're doing a good job at podcasting. Otherwise, if someone has
like
to first look for your face to clearly
I
you're not
like
doing
that.
a podcast.
I like that. I like how you put it. I like that. Yeah, I like the way you've put it because if somebody is able to listen to you without watching you, then
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
okay.
Mm.
But I mean, people can maybe they're able to listen to it without. I don't know. I really don't know.
It's a
But
free world. Yeah, it
yeah,
reminds me of the influencing space on social media when there's a time when I was just starting out in my comms career, and then there were these influencers, and someone would post like a picture of themselves, and they'd have about like 100,000 likes, and then when they post something about a particular product or service or and they not even make 50 likes, and then you're thinking I like to think about it the same way. Like numbers matter and yet they don't. So same.
exactly.
Yeah, so
And
when you're saying, "Oh, I'm a name on social media. I'm a big guy in Kampala social spaces. I start a podcast and I have, I don't know, 50." You're really not building honest, legit community for your podcast.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree with that 100% because I've seen that with my personal podcast. I started out of, you say they call it getting out of the mud.
Mm.
When I started with one person, you get two, three, four,
Yeah.
and right now having almost hitting 11,000 followers on Instagram
Mm.
and hitting like 3,000 followers on YouTube, and
And all
my
that is authentic, organic, yeah.
organic, yeah, I didn't put any money to it. But also what you were saying and what we were talking about earlier, a lot of
Mm.
people listen to my podcast on audio, a lot, because the numbers on audio are crazy. Like across all other platforms, the Spotify, Apple Podcasts, they're in 200,000 listens. 200,000. Not
Yeah.
even close. It's not even close to what you see on YouTube or what you see on Instagram or where. And
I think that's really good. Then you're doing a good job at podcasting. Honestly, I've been trying to kill my social media addiction and scrolling, and I've been trying to like stay away from short form content. I
Mhm.
honestly only listen to audio podcasts, even when I know. So the only time I've gone to YouTube is to see Mel Robbins' face. What does she look like? How does her
Yeah.
studio look like? Same for Jay Shetty. Or most of
Mhm.
the times I am on the podcast app a lot of times just so that I train my mind to pay attention. Like, do not forget me. You know how you're listening to an audiobook and you zone out for
Mhm.
like 30 seconds, you come back and you've lost an entire paragraph and you're like, what was that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think the fact that I've been training myself to like I want to listen through this 1 hour episode and just follow the conversation without the urge to see how they look like. Or
Yeah.
I think it helps to turn your attention. I have a friend who usually challenges me about a lot of stuff. And we were talking about the new podcast that was coming out. And they sort of led me some angle and we ended up arguing, and I'm like, hey, you just want to argue with me, don't you? They were saying they were talking about accessibility. How are the people in Kaberamaido not listening to podcasts and we are okay with that? I don't know what you think about that. They were talking about accessibility for people in rural areas and ability to understand the language. So someone in like the trenches of this country doesn't have access to internet, cannot speak the language. So are we like, oh, we don't care about these people, or they don't need this information, or
I mean, when it gets down to that, we can only do too much as people. If some plus don't get internet, what are we gonna like? What are you gonna do?
yeah,
Isn't really much you can do about it. But any place that I liked,
yeah,
there's one guy who had a show on YouTube, and he said, "We're everywhere like internet gets and signal gets, and we're not." Like he meant like if there's no internet, we're not there, and that's what podcast is. But with this technology, I think like even with phones and stuff, like people can get data on their phone. Or check it, right? So
yeah,
if
yeah.
if they can get data on their phone to go on Facebook, on Instagram, on WhatsApp, I'm sure they can get data to go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts to listen to podcasts. And it made it easier that it's not only one platform. I don't know how many platforms, audio platform to podcast, but there is like more than 20. Boomplay,
Oh yeah,
Google Podcast,
yeah, yeah.
YouTube Music, Smania, Amazon, what? So there's
Podbean, yeah. There's so many.
Podbean, yeah, those. I even go sometimes. I go on internet and then I look where my podcast is at, and you see like, Banana, there's also this
Yeah,
platform.
there's so many.
Exactly. So I think that if they get internet, they should be able to get to your podcast, and you should just do promoting it. Some of the things I've learned is self-taught. One other thing that you talked about, if they can't understand you,
The
I had an
language. Yeah.
argument. I had an argument with somebody on TikTok, and TikTok is going to spoil Uganda. I'm sorry to say,
I think
in
it
in a way
already
that
is.
because people on TikTok, Ugandans have made TikTok to be a local thing. Like if it's not in Luganda, we won't listen to it. Like who says that? Like somebody was saying the same thing. I put my content up on TikTok by like clips that I get out of my podcast. And some
Okay.
guy was like, "Bino tutugenda dude, it's in Luganda." He said, "If you did your podcast in Luganda, it would sell a lot." I was like, "No, I'm not limiting my podcast to just Uganda. I'm not doing. I mean, I'm doing for Ugandans, but somebody else is gonna tune in. Like when you go to analytics of my podcast audio, it plays all over the world, like in Philippines, Canada, in Mexico. So when you do it in English, you're putting a wider um variety, like a wider audience to it. If you limit it to Luganda, you are actually even if you do it in Luganda, there's some people in Uganda who won't be able to listen to it because they don't speak Luganda. You see, so like I told him that I'm sticking to English because at least there, not everybody speaks English in Uganda. I know in Uganda, but at least there, it
Mm.
helps to reach a lot of people when you do it in English. So when I do mine in English, I pray that maybe there's a lot of people who can speak English and they're able to understand that. So that's the only way I can think of that, like helping people who cannot understand the language. Like in Kaberamaido, where you were saying, like if you speak in Luganda, some people in there in Kaberamaido don't speak Luganda, so they're not going to be able to understand what you're saying. I mean, it's okay for people to put in a Luganda word or phrase. I do that a lot because it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like people think I don't speak Luganda because I'm in the US. I've been here for like 12 years. So I try to speak some Luganda to remind them that this is in me and it's not going anywhere. But I don't do an episode in Luganda. Oh, sometimes I
Mm.
did it to prove to people that I can hold a conversation in Luganda. Nibacho no kutya.
Yeah.
Ndi muzibu
Haha.
tebantu.
Buddy guy. So there's a one random Ugandan human being somewhere who planned on starting a podcast this year with the goal of making money out of it.
Yeah.
Like the ultimate goal is like, I'm going to buy this equipment, buy this expensive. Oh, by the way, let's not even get started with the expensive equipment. I'm going
Uh-uh.
to start all this,
Yeah.
blah, 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 and I need to make money. What
Mhm.
would you say to them?
It's funny you bring that question. And when I first had my first interview at NRG Radio, or
Mm,
I did a live podcast in Uganda, my first ever live podcast where I had people come and a live event, and we did a live podcast with guests. I had actually 4 guests. But after that, I was invited to NRG to go talk about that, how the experience was. And one thing that I told them is the first thing I said was people who join podcasting thinking they're going to make money.
mm,
Yes, there's people that make money, but if you look at it, the J Shadys we're talking about, they have like 1 million downloads. They have like 1 million blah blah blah. They are like they're famous. They've been working on it for a longer time than you have or we have, you know. So they have accumulated
mm,
the following and all that stuff, which it takes time. But if you're just starting out in Uganda and you be like, I'm going to make money, is that's the one thing that's gonna pull you down. Even it's gonna kill the passion, the little passion that you've had for podcasting, because that money is not gonna come. You'll be there, you will bring up the topic of expenses and you kind of just put it down. But that's the other thing. Like you'll be there, you need a microphone, you need a computer, you need lights, you need
mm.
VT, and then now you want to do, because YouTube is paying, then you want to do a video to put on YouTube so you can get the YouTube money too. But you
Yeah.
incur costs. And but again, I would say this thing, if you're serious about it, it requires investment. People compliment
Yeah.
me about like, man, your quality of work is good. Your videos on YouTube, on TikTok, they're clear. How do you do it? Yes, we put invested in it. But for me, the difference is I look at this as a hobby for now, not as a job or not as something to make money out of it. I love doing a podcast just to talk, just
Yeah.
to create content, you know. I good thing I have a full-time job, and that's why I tell people like have a job and then do podcasting as something you love to do, because if you're trying to do that as a job, it's going to drain you, it's going to get you frustrated, it's going to get you to quit, because days are going to be hard sometimes. The money
Yeah.
is not gonna come. You're going to spend a lot of money before you even get that money back. It's
I
just
hear.
now that I've started getting some money from YouTube, TikTok, Spotify, and you add it around, but it's still the money that I've invested in, which I'm not complaining, but the
Yeah.
money
Yeah.
that because I've wanted to I wanted. I made a decision to invest in it, and getting the money back makes me happy. But even without the money, I'm not going anywhere. I'm doing
Mm.
this because that wasn't my intention at first
Ooh.
to start the podcast. It wasn't about money.
Mm. Yeah, that's nice. I could let me just that's very reaffirming. Very
Yeah,
reaffirming. Yeah,
yeah,
when I was doing my old podcast, I don't know what I expected. Most of it was projected from like even just life itself. I thought if I showed up at life 1, 2 years of consistent hard work and like I thought life would pay off. Like I don't know, I would like blow up.
yeah.
And not at any point did I, of course, think of quitting podcasting. But then I expected some grand unfolding of my podcast, which didn't come. So when you say it like that, whew,
Yeah.
very timely, very reaffirming, very reassuring. This is the part where you introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Bonny Kibuuka, the host of the Ugandan Boy Talk Show podcast. So one thing people wouldn't believe about me, if people just see my podcast on social media, they think that's what I do. That's my job.
Mm.
But actually, it's not. I have a full time job that I do. I'm an
Mm.
aircraft mechanic. I keep grinding, and this is just a side gig.
Nice. Nice. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Bonnie. This was an absolute pleasure